Get your daughter and your bags out of my cabin before you delay this entire aircraft. Look me in the eye and say that again. Say exactly what you mean by passengers who belong. These words landed in row 2 of a Coastal Sky Airlines cabin parked at Gate C-14 of Denver International Airport, and every head within 4 rows turned toward the sound of them. Because there is a particular pitch a stranger's voice takes on, right before a room remembers it forever. Diane Halloway did not blink. 14 years of seniority had taught her that repeating a command with more weight usually ended a disagreement before it became a scene. "Take your daughter and your bags to the back," she said again, slower this time, savoring the slowness. "Move now, or I will have you removed." The man she was speaking to did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He simply turned his head, slowly, the way a man turns who has spent 3 decades learning that the fastest way to lose a room is to give it the reaction it is fishing for, and asked her a single question in a voice so level it seemed to cool the air around it. "What exactly do you mean by passengers who belong here, Miss Halloway?" Her name tag caught the cabin light. She had not expected him to read it. "Dad, are they going to make us leave the plane?" The voice belonged to a 10-year-old girl in the window seat, a tablet forgotten in her lap. Her eyes moving between her father and the woman standing over him, with one hand extended toward the overhead bin, as if she already owned whatever was inside it. Elias Whitfield had asked the question quietly. The way children ask questions they already suspect they know the answer to, hoping to be told they are wrong. "No, sweetheart, we are safe. If your father keeps causing a scene, that is exactly what will happen," Diane said, and something in the way she said it, light and almost pleasant, made 3 passengers nearby lower their phones at once. "Do not speak to my daughter like she is a bargaining chip," the man said. "If you want a confrontation, Miss Halloway, you look at me, not at a 10-year-old. He rose from his seat then, unhurried, and reached up to lift his daughter's small navy suitcase from the overhead bin himself, before Diane Halloway's hand could close around the handle first. 12 rows of first and premium economy passengers had gone still in that particular way people go still when they sense a story is beginning that they will still be telling their coworkers on Monday morning. Nobody on that aircraft knew who Elias Whitfield actually was. To the 11 people seated close enough to watch, he was simply a man in seat 2A, an older black passenger traveling with his young daughter. Easy enough, in Diane Halloway's estimation, to relocate. She had made her decision from 4 rows away, scanning her tablet with a studied, deliberate slowness that suggested she had already decided what she would find before she ever reached his row. She had done this before. She would tell herself later that she had done nothing at all. He said nothing further. He reached for Naya's hand, gathered the last of their belongings from the seat-back pocket, and began, without argument, to walk toward the rear of the aircraft, past 9 rows of strangers who would spend the next hour deciding, privately, whether they had just watched something ordinary or something they would never fully be able to explain to anyone who had not seen it themselves. What none of them knew yet was that the quiet man walking toward the last row of economy, past the galley, past the lavatory nobody wanted to sit beside, had commanded an entire fighter wing, that he had flown missions most people only read about in official citations, that the plain steel ring on his right hand, worn smooth after 34 years, was not decoration. It was inheritance. And it was about to matter more than Diane Halloway could have imagined, in a way that would follow her for the rest of her career. Elias Whitfield had retired 18 months earlier as a lieutenant general in the United States Air Force, closing out a 30-year career that included 3 combat deployments, command of the 94th Fighter Wing, and a Distinguished Flying Cross earned for a rescue mission that 3 surviving men still called him every year, on the same date, to thank him for. He wore no insignia today. Nothing marked him as anything other than a father flying his daughter to Charlotte, North Carolina, for his nephew's college graduation. The only trace of 30 years of service on his person was that ring, a gift from his late father, a Korean War veteran, who had never been permitted to attend the Air Force Academy himself, on account of the era he had been born into, and who had spent 3 years of overtime shifts at a Pittsburgh steel plant to have a matching ring forged the week his son graduated. His father had placed it in his palm in the family's living room, hands trembling, and told him that some doors take an entire generation to open, and that the ring itself was never really the point. The point was what it meant that the door had finally opened at all. Elias had promised his wife, Camille, a pediatrician whose own career had absorbed most of the family's flexibility during his years of active duty, that he would keep Naya entertained and out of trouble for the 2 days they would be traveling without her. He had called her from the gate that morning, the way they always did before any trip, and told her everything looked routine. It was the kind of small, ordinary lie a person tells not out of dishonesty, but out of genuine belief in the moment that the day really would be as uneventful as it appeared. He had no idea, standing at gate C14 for 40 minutes earlier, exactly how far from routine the next 2 hours were about to become. Keep that steel ring in mind. It comes back at the very end of this story, and by the time it does, you will understand exactly why he never took it off. Diane Halloway had worked for Coastal Sky Airlines for 14 years, the last 6 as lead purser over the first-class cabin, a position she described to colleagues, more than once, as a matter of maintaining proper standards. She had a well-documented history among her coworkers of scrutinizing certain passengers with a closeness she reserved for no one else on the manifest, always with some procedural justification ready if anyone dared to ask. The pattern had drawn 2 quiet complaints to base management over the years. Both had gone nowhere. Colleagues who worked alongside her described her privately as territorial about the cabin, in a way that went beyond ordinary service pride, keeping an unspoken mental inventory of which passengers fit the image she preferred and which did not. One former colleague, who had transferred bases largely to escape working under Halloway's shifts, would later tell an internal investigator that the pattern had been an open secret among crew for years, tolerated mostly because passengers rarely complained loudly enough or specifically enough to trigger any real consequence, and because Diane herself was remarkably skilled at framing every incident as an isolated, defensible judgment call, rather than part of anything larger. Elias had boarded normally that morning at 7:12 a.m., presented a legitimately purchased first-class ticket, seat 2A and 2B, stowed his and Naya's belongings without incident, and settled in for what he expected to be an unremarkable 3-hour and 40-minute flight. He had noticed Diane watching him during boarding with a particular kind of attention, the specific scrutiny he recognized from 3 decades of being the only black officer in rooms that assumed leadership looked like someone else. He said nothing. He hoped, as he often did, that the assumption would simply pass without needing to become anything. He had booked those first-class seats 3 weeks earlier, purely as a small treat for Nia, whose only previous experience with air travel, 2 years prior, had been a cramped overnight economy flight that left her exhausted and cranky for an entire family reunion. He wanted this trip to feel different, a celebration, not an endurance test. He had not hesitated over the extra cost once he saw how excited she became. Scrolling through photos of first-class cabins on his phone, asking him detailed questions all week about whether the seats really turned into beds and whether the food was different from what they got at home. That is the earnestness Diane Halloway was standing over when she reached for his daughter's suitcase. There has been a mix-up with the seating manifest, she said. Once he was fully in the aisle, her voice sliding into a rehearsed, professional smoothness, the specific tone crew members use when they expect a request to be accepted without pushback. This seat needs to go to another passenger. I will have someone show you to your actual seats in the back. Elias reached for the boarding pass in his jacket pocket rather than raising his voice, the way he had learned, across 3 decades of command, that the fastest way to diffuse an unreasonable demand is almost never to match its energy. I purchased this seat directly through your airline 3 weeks ago, he said. My daughter and I are seated together in row 2. Is there a specific problem with our tickets? Diane glanced at the boarding pass without fully reading it. Her attention had already drifted toward a well-dressed man in his 40s, standing in the aisle behind her, someone who had clearly just mentioned a seating preference of his own. I understand you paid for a seat, she said, in the tone of someone explaining something to a child. But seating assignments can be adjusted at the discretion of the crew when there's a service issue. I need you and your daughter to gather your things. What service issue? Elias asked, still level, still calm, still notably not moving. Sir, I don't need to explain every cabin decision to you. I am the lead purser on this flight. A uniform does not give you permission to invent rules and humiliate paying passengers in front of their children, Elias said. And it was the first time his voice had carried any edge at all, though even that edge sounded more like disappointment than anger. Excuse me, Diane's face tightened. You have no right to speak to me that way. Dad, are they going to throw us off the plane? Nia asked again, her voice smaller now, and this time it was the businessman in seat 3B who flinched, not Elias. If your father keeps causing trouble, Diane said, turning toward the girl for half a second before catching herself. That is exactly what is going to happen. Do not threaten my daughter, Elias said. And something in the stillness of his posture made the man in 3B quietly close his laptop. If you want a confrontation, you look at me, not at a 10-year-old child. Sit down and comply, or I will have security remove you from this aircraft, Diane snapped, her volume climbing for the first time. Loud enough that a flight attendant 3 rows back, a woman named Talia Brooks, 2 months into working this particular route, looked up sharply from the galley. Diane, that's enough, Talia said, stepping into the aisle. I can check the manifest myself. There's clearly some confu. Stay out of this, Talia. Diane cut her off without looking back. Go to the rear galley before I write you up for insubordination. Elias watched all of it without moving, the particular stillness of a man cataloging every detail for a report he had not yet decided to file. He did not know yet that he would not need to file one at all. Someone else was about to do it for him. In a way, none of them could have predicted from where they were standing. You decided my daughter and I did not belong in this cabin before you ever reached our row, he said quietly. That is the only decision that matters here. Security will be the ones dealing with insubordination. In a moment, Diane said, already turning to signal toward the front of the plane, and it is worth pausing here, before the story moves forward, to notice something. She had not once, in this entire exchange, looked at his boarding pass long enough to actually read the name printed on it. She was about to. Reeves gathered his and Naya's bags from the overhead bin without further argument, lifting his daughter's backpack onto his own shoulder alongside his carry-on, and stepped into the aisle to give Diane room to finalize the arrangement she had clearly decided upon before she ever reached his row. Right this way, she said, with the same practiced, cheerful efficiency of someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than requests, already gesturing the displaced businessman toward the now vacant seat before Elias had even fully stood. The man himself, dressed for what looked like a routine work trip, glanced almost apologetically at Elias as he settled into seat 2A, seemingly aware, even in the moment, that something about the exchange did not sit entirely right, though not quite motivated enough by that discomfort to decline the unexpected upgrade. He would later tell the captain, during a very different conversation, than the one he expected to have that day. That he had simply assumed the situation was legitimate. He had no idea the original passenger's ticket had been perfectly valid the entire time. Elias followed Diane down the aisle, Naya's hand in his, past rows of passengers who watched the procession with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Several of them glanced back toward the first-class cabin with the specific expression of people who understood exactly what they had just witnessed, even if none of them said so out loud. One older gentleman seated in premium economy, a retired civil rights attorney named Harold Voss, caught Elias's eye briefly as he passed, offering a small, sympathetic nod. The particular gesture of recognition between two strangers who both understood something about the specific indignity of being moved without explanation in front of an audience. Elias returned the nod and kept walking. The seats Diane led them to sat in the very last row of the aircraft, against the rear galley wall, seats that did not recline, directly beside the lavatory. They also lacked the small entertainment screens available throughout the rest of the cabin. A detail Nia noticed almost immediately, glancing toward her father with quiet disappointment before catching herself and deciding not to add complaint to a situation that already felt heavy enough. Diane turned and walked back toward the front of the plane without a backward glance. "Dad," Nia said, once they were seated, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "That wasn't fair. Why didn't you say something?" "I did say something, sweetheart," he answered, his voice carrying the same steadiness he had used with Diane moments earlier. "I just didn't shout it. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm long enough for the truth to catch up to the room on its own." Talia Brooks approached them a few minutes later, carrying a bottle of water and an apology that seemed to come from her own conscience rather than any policy requiring it. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "That's not usually how we handle seating. I don't know exactly what happened up there, but it didn't look right to me either." Elias thanked her, said he appreciated the water, and made no further comment, more focused on keeping Nia's mood from souring further than on litigating the injustice with every crew member who happened to pass. 10 minutes went by with the aircraft still parked at the gate, no announcement made about departure. The delay itself beginning to draw quiet murmurs from passengers, checking connecting flight times on their phones. None of them yet knew the reason for the delay had a name, and that name was already climbing the stairs to the flight deck. Diane Halloway had gone to speak with the captain, not to report what she had done, but to request formal backup for what she intended to do next, because in the 4 rows she had just walked past, 12 strangers with their phones raised had turned this into something bigger than a seating dispute, and she had decided, with the same unshakable certainty she brought to everything, that the man in the back row needed to be handled before this delay became her problem in any official sense. She did not know, stepping onto that flight deck, that the woman in the captain's seat had spent 4 years as a junior officer under Elias Whitfield's command, 12 years earlier at Nellis Air Force Base. Captain Sandra Whitlock had built her entire post-military career on the discipline General Whitfield had drilled into her during 4 years of joint operations training, back when she was a 26-year-old captain, still learning how to hold a room under pressure. She still remembered, word for word, the thing he had told her after her first failed briefing, when she had come to his office, ready to hand in her wings out of pure humiliation. "Composure is a skill you build through repetition," he had told her. "Not something you're simply born with. I have failed to stay calm plenty of times. I just learned how, eventually, and so will you." She had never forgotten that sentence. She had built an entire flying career on top of it. "I need you to hold departure and back me up on removing a difficult passenger from the aircraft," Diane said, stepping onto the flight deck with the tone of someone who expected agreement as a formality. "He's in the last row now." refused to comply with a seating reassignment, made a scene, upset several passengers. "What's the passenger's name?" Sandra asked, not looking up from her checklist. "Whitfield," Diane said. "Some older gentleman traveling with his kid. Frankly, Captain." He was combative from the moment I approached him. Sandra Whitlock's hand stopped moving over the checklist entirely. "Say that name again." "Whitfield. E. Whitfield, according to the manifest." There was a silence on that flight deck that lasted perhaps 4 full seconds, though it would feel, to Diane Halloway, considerably longer. The specific kind of silence that arrives right before a room's entire understanding of a situation rearranges itself without warning. "Get the manifest," Sandra said, already unbuckling. Now, she walked the length of the aircraft herself, past first class, past economy, past the rows of passengers who fell quiet as they registered the captain's uniform, moving purposefully down the aisle, all the way to the last row where a man sat with his daughter's head resting against his shoulder, both of them watching a delays stretch past its 20th minute with the patience of people who had learned not to expect an explanation. "General Whitfield," Sandra said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, in a way that surprised even her. Elias looked up. Recognition moved across his face slowly, the particular expression of a man reaching back 12 years to place a name to a face he had not expected to see again in a place like this. "Captain Whitlock. It's been a long time. I need you to tell me exactly what happened at your original seat," she said, crouching into the aisle beside him, her voice quiet now, urgent. "Please, all of it," he told her. Not with anger, not with performance, simply the facts in order, the way he had once trained an entire wing of officers to deliver a debrief. Sandra Whitlock listened to every word, without interrupting, her jaw tightening slightly with each new detail, and when he finished, she stood, straightened her uniform, and said something that would be repeated by at least 6 passengers in that cabin for the rest of the day. "This aircraft is not moving until this is corrected. All of it." She turned and walked back up the aisle, past Diane Halloway, who was standing near the galley with her tablet still in hand, still absolutely certain, in the way only Diane Halloway could be certain, that she had done nothing wrong. "Captain, I don't understand what the issue is," Diane started. "I made a judgment call regarding cabin." "You made a judgment call about a retired lieutenant general of the United States Air Force," Sandra said. And this time, her voice carried across the entire first-class cabin, without needing to be raised at all. "You moved him and his 10-year-old daughter to the back of this aircraft, past the lavatory, and gave his paid seat to a stranger, because you decided, on sight, that he didn't belong there." "That's not." "I didn't know who he was," Diane said, and it is worth noting exactly what she said next, because it would be repeated back to her, almost verbatim, in an investigation room 3 weeks later. "That's not something I could have known just by looking at him." The words hung in the cabin for a long moment. Nobody said anything. A dozen passengers, who had watched the entire incident unfold, now understood, all at once, precisely what those words meant, and precisely what they had just watched happen. "That is exactly the problem," Sandra said quietly. "You shouldn't need to know who somebody is to treat them decently." She turned to a nearby gate agent who had come aboard to assist with the delay, and gave 2 instructions in rapid succession. "Get General Whitfield and his daughter back into seat 2A and 2B immediately, with a formal written apology from the airline before wheels up, and remove Diane Halloway from working duty on this flight, effective immediately, pending a full review." "You can't do that over one misunderstanding," Diane said, and there it was again, misunderstanding. The word she would keep reaching for through every version of this story she told for the rest of the year, the word that let her keep standing exactly where she already was. "I can," Sandra said, "and I am." What none of the passengers watching this unfold yet realized was that this was only the beginning of what was coming for Diane Halloway. The ground hold that followed would last 51 minutes. It would generate 14 separate passenger statements, and it would eventually surface something far larger than a single bad decision on a single Tuesday morning flight to Charlotte. Talia Brooks was the first to come forward with more. Once the aircraft crew had been temporarily reshuffled and Diane escorted off the plane by 2 gate agents, Talia approached Sandra quietly near the galley and told her something she had been sitting on for 2 months, uncertain of her own read on it at the time. "This isn't the first time," Talia said. "I worked 1 flight under her in June. There was an older Hispanic couple in first class, and she did almost the exact same thing, moved them back with some story about a manifest error. I didn't say anything then because I wasn't sure what I'd actually seen. But watching it happen again, exactly the same way, there's no room left for that kind of doubt." Sandra wrote it down. She would not be the only one collecting names that day. Denise Calloway, an off-duty nurse seated near the front of economy, had quietly filmed the final 90 seconds of Elias's walk to the back of the plane, uncertain at the time what she intended to do with the footage, unwilling only to let the moment pass entirely undocumented. She handed her phone to a gate agent before the flight resumed, along with her name and number. Harold Voss, the retired civil rights attorney in premium economy, wrote out a full statement by hand while the plane sat at the gate, noting, with the precision of 30 years of legal practice, the exact language Diane had used and the exact order in which she had used it, and the businessman who had been given seat 2A, the one who had glanced apologetically at Elias as he sat down, gave his own account without being asked twice, telling Sandra plainly that he had felt something was wrong the entire time and had simply not wanted to be the one to say so out loud. By the time the aircraft pushed back from the gate, 58 minutes late, 4 separate written statements existed describing what had happened in row 2. And Diane Halloway was already sitting in a windowless office at the base, still explaining to her shift supervisor that she had simply been maintaining cabin standards, still absolutely convinced, even as the words left her mouth, that she had done nothing that warranted this level of response. She would keep believing that in one form or another for 3 more weeks. The flight to Charlotte, once it finally departed, was unremarkable in every way Elias had originally hoped it would be. Naya fell asleep somewhere over Kansas, her head against his shoulder, and he sat quietly for a long while afterward, watching the clouds pass beneath the wing, thinking not about Diane Halloway or the delay or whatever investigation would inevitably follow, but simply about the particular privilege of being trusted with a child's questions about fairness and getting to answer them honestly. That evening, once they had checked into their hotel ahead of the graduation, Nia asked him the question that had clearly been sitting with her since the airport. "Dad, were you scared?" "When she made us move, I mean." Elias considered the question honestly before answering, turning the plain steel ring on his finger the way he sometimes did when thinking something through carefully. "Not scared exactly," he said. "More disappointed, if I'm honest. Disappointed that it still happens, even now. But I wasn't scared, because I've spent 30 years learning that staying calm doesn't mean staying silent. It just means choosing your moment instead of handing it to somebody who wants to watch you lose control." "Did it feel different, knowing Captain Whitlock used to work for you?" Naya asked. "Would you have felt as okay about it if nobody on that plane had known who you were?" He thought carefully about that one, because it deserved more than a reflexive answer. "Honestly, a little," he admitted. "It's easier when the truth catches up to the room fast. But I would have been just as calm either way, sweetheart. The calm was never about waiting for somebody to recognize me. It was about not letting somebody else's mistake decide how I was going to act." "Would you have said something at all if she hadn't recognized you?" "Yes," he said, after a long moment. Maybe not as fast. Maybe it would have taken longer to fix. But I was never going to let that seat change be the end of the story either way. Some things you handle quietly. That one, eventually, I'd have handled out loud. Naya reached over and touched the ring on his hand. The same one her grandfather had spent 3 years of overtime shifts saving for. The same one Elias had worn through 34 years of a career most people in that cabin would never fully understand. "Can I have one of these someday?" she asked. "When I do something that matters enough." Elias smiled at that, the first fully unguarded smile he had allowed himself since the flight began. "You don't earn a ring like this by doing one big thing," he told her. "You earn it by choosing, over and over, on ordinary days when nobody's watching, to be the kind of person worth trusting with something bigger later. You're already doing that. The ring just eventually catches up to it. Keep watching, because the ring is not finished with this story yet. Neither is Diane Halloway. What happens to her over the following 3 weeks is where this story stops being about one bad flight and starts being about every flight she never let anyone see. The internal investigation opened on a Thursday and did not close quietly. Robert Kessler, Coastal Sky Airlines Vice President of Customer Experience, flew from the airline's Atlanta headquarters to Denver personally once General Whitfield's identity, and Talia Brooks's statement, and Harold Voss's handwritten account, and Denise Calloway's 90 seconds of video had all landed on the same desk within the same 72 hours. What he found once his team began gabbling records was not one incident. It was a pattern that had simply never had enough weight behind it before to break through. 9 formal seating complaints had been filed against Diane Halloway over 6 years, all involving passengers of color, all resolved internally as isolated judgment calls, all quietly closed without further review. 2 separate coworkers had requested base transfers specifically to avoid working her shifts. One prior passenger, a Nigerian-American software engineer named Dr. Adezen Wasu, had filed a formal complaint 18 months earlier after being moved from first class under nearly identical circumstances, a complaint that had been resolved with a travel voucher and no further action. Robert Kessler read all 9 files in a single afternoon. Sitting in a conference room at Denver International with the door closed, and later told his own team that it was the 9th file, not the video, not the general's rank, not even Captain Whitlock's testimony, that finally made him understand exactly what the airline had been allowing to continue for 6 years, under the label of proper standards. Diane Halloway was called into a formal review 3 weeks after the flight to Charlotte. She arrived with a union representative and a folder of her own, prepared, still, to explain her side. "I want to be clear," she told the panel, "that I did not know who General Whitfield was when I made my decision. I was following my own judgment about cabin service, the same judgment I've used for 14 years. That is precisely the finding of this review," Robert Kessler said, sliding the folder of 9 prior complaints across the table toward her. "Your judgment applied consistently to one type of passenger." Diane looked down at the folder. She did not open it right away. "These were all handled at the time," she said quietly. "Nobody found a pattern before now. Nobody looked hard enough before now," Kessler said. "We are looking now." She was terminated that same afternoon, not quietly, not with a severance package designed to keep the story contained, but with a formal statement the airline released to every employee at her base the following morning, acknowledging a pattern of discriminatory treatment and announcing a full retraining program for every purser and lead flight attendant across the airline's first-class cabins. Her union grievance, filed the following week, was denied within 11 days. Once the panel reviewing it read the same 9 files Robert Kessler had read. Even then, in the final meeting of her formal appeal, sitting across from a review board that had already made its decision, Diane Halloway did not say the words "I was wrong." She said, instead, that she felt the airline was making an example of her for something crew members did every day. She said she had never intended harm. She said, more than once, that she had simply been trying to protect the standards of the cabin she was responsible for. It would take her considerably longer than 11 days to arrive anywhere close to the truth of what she had actually done. 4 months later, Elias Whitfield received an invitation from Coastal Sky Airlines training division, not through Robert Kessler, but through Captain Sandra Whitlock, who had personally requested. He be asked to speak at the airline's newly mandated bias and de-escalation training, now required annually for every lead flight attendant across the company's fleet. He accepted on one condition. He did not want to speak about Diane Halloway by name. He wanted to speak about the pattern underneath her, the one that had let 9 complaints disappear before a 10th one, backed by rank and witnesses and video, finally forced the airline to look. The training room at Coastal Sky's Denver facility held 60 employees the morning he spoke, most of them lead flight attendants and pursers from bases across the country. He wore a plain gray suit, no medals, no insignia, just the steel ring on his right hand. And he spoke for nearly 20 minutes, drawing on examples from his own career about the cost of assumptions made too quickly under pressure, careful never to frame his remarks as a lecture about one specific flight. Though everyone in that room understood precisely which incident had prompted the invitation in the first place. He closed by telling them that his daughter had asked him, the same evening it happened, whether he had been scared. His honest answer, he told the room, was that fear had very little to do with what actually mattered in a moment like that. What mattered was whether you let the moment define how you treated the people around you, or whether you let your own composure become the example somebody else needed to see. I would ask each of you, he said, to think carefully about which example you want to be the next time a judgment call like that lands in your hands. The room stayed remarkably quiet through his remarks. Several attendees took notes. A few exchanged glances that suggested his words had landed somewhere personal, not abstract. Talig Brooks, invited to attend as the crew member whose report had helped initiate the investigation, sat near the front, catching his eye once during the talk with a small, proud smile. After the session ended, several attendees approached him individually. One flight attendant admitted quietly that she recognized something of her own past behavior in his description of quick, unexamined judgments, thanking him for framing the conversation in a way that invited reflection rather than defensiveness. A younger gate agent asked whether he had always found it this easy to stay composed while delivering a difficult message, and he told her honestly that composure was a skill built through repetition, not something anyone simply possesses from the start, that he had failed to stay calm plenty of times earlier in his career, before finally learning how. A third attendee, an older purser nearing retirement herself, lingered until the room had mostly cleared before approaching him quietly, admitting that she had worked alongside Diane Halloway for years and had always suspected something about her judgment, without ever finding the right moment or the right words to raise it formally. Raising it now, even years late, still matters, he told her. This airline seems finally ready to listen. She thanked him quietly, gathered her things, and left the training room with the particular relief of someone who had finally set down a weight she had been carrying far longer than she probably realized. There is one more conversation from that day worth knowing about, because it is the one that finally cracked something open in Diane Halloway that 11 days of appeals and 9 buried complaints and 1 formal termination letter had never managed to reach. 6 months after the flight, working a customer service position at a regional car rental counter, Diane Halloway found herself standing across from a woman requesting a rental car upgrade. A woman traveling alone with a slight limp, dressed plainly, waiting patiently in a line that had grown longer than the counter staff could comfortably manage. Diane recognized, almost immediately and almost against her will, the exact shape of the decision forming in her own mind, the instinct to quietly deprioritize this particular customer's request in favor of someone further back in line who simply looked, to her eye, like someone who belonged in the nicer car. She caught herself mid-thought. She stood there, keys in hand, and felt something she had spent 14 years never fully allowing herself to feel, not defensiveness, not the reflexive need to justify a judgment call, but the plain, uncomfortable recognition of exactly what that judgment call actually was, every single time she had ever made one. She gave the woman the upgrade. She went home that night and, for the first time in 6 months, did not reach for a single explanation. 3 weeks after that, she wrote a letter, not to the airline, not to a review board, but to Elias Whitfield directly, care of Coastal Skies Training Division. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it did not ask for her job back. It said, in part, that she had spent 6 months telling herself a story about being made an example of, and that it had taken a woman with a slight limp and a rental car counter for her to finally understand that the story had never been about her at all. It said she was sorry, not for the delay, not for the paperwork, but for the specific look on his daughter's face when she asked whether they were going to be thrown off the plane, a detail Diane realized she had never once let herself actually picture until that moment at the counter. Elias read the letter twice. He did not write back right away. When he finally did, 3 weeks later, his reply was 4 sentences long. It told her that an apology arriving late is still worth more than one that never arrives at all. That he hoped she carried what she had learned into whatever she did next, and that the woman at that rental counter would probably never know what she had actually given Diane that day. He did not say he forgave her. He did not say he didn't. He simply signed it and let that be enough. It is worth sitting with that letter for a moment before this story ends, because it says something the rest of this story only shows in pieces. Consequences do not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as a mirror, held up at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the wrong line, at exactly the counter where a person finally has nowhere left to look but at themselves. A year after the flight to Charlotte, Naya Whitfield turned 11. For her birthday, her father gave her a small gift, wrapped in brown paper, no ribbon. Inside was a thin silver bracelet, not the steel ring, not yet, he told her, smiling. That one still has some catching up to do, but a smaller promise of the same idea. Engraved on the inside, in letters small enough that only she would ever need to read them, were 7 words. Choose calm. Choose it on purpose. Every time. She wears it still. She has never once had to be told what it means. If this story meant something to you, if you saw yourself in the calm father or the flight attendant who finally spoke up, or even, uncomfortably, in the woman standing at that rental counter 6 months later, take a moment to like it so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who has ever been told, quietly or loudly, that they did not belong somewhere they had every right to be. And tell me in the comments, honestly, which moment stayed with you the longest? The walk to the back of the plane, Captain Whitlock crouching into that aisle, or Diane standing at that rental counter, finally seeing herself clearly for the first time. I read every single one. This story is a work of fiction. Every name in it is invented, but the pattern underneath it is not, and it does not require a general's rank, or a captain who remembers your training, or a stranger filming from 3 rows back. For someone to deserve to be treated with basic decency the very first time, not the second, not the 10th, and never only after the truth finally catches up to the room.